Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar today, which is on shoreline trends and best management practices for Lake Charlevoix. My name is Ryan Blazik. I'm with Eagle's Environmental Support Division. I'm just going to be helping to facilitate the webinar and then pulling levers and pressing buttons behind the scenes here today. But before we get started, I just have a couple things to go through if you're not familiar with the Zoom platform or how we do webinars. All lines are muted during the webinar, so you'll be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. You can submit your questions at any time using the question box in your Zoom toolbar. There'll be a couple question and answer periods where we'll try to answer your questions, or we might answer your question to you directly. We're also recording this webinar, so you'll receive a link in a few days to the webinar that you can re-watch it or catch parts you missed if you didn't see it all. And with that, I would like to go ahead and get started and invite Eric Calabro with Eagle to go ahead and start the webinar. So Eric, you can take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, everybody. I just wanted to pop my face up on the screen real quick, and I'm going to turn off my camera here and share my screen. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Just a second. And you guys can see my screen, right?
Yep, looks good, Eric.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar. I'm really excited to dive into Lake Charlevoix and talk about some best management practices. And thank you to Tip of the Mint Watershed Council for kind of collaborating with us on this and joining in and providing your expertise. My name is Eric Calabro. I'm the Inland Lakes Analyst with Eagle's Water Resources Division in the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams Unit. Large part of my job is providing support to regulatory staff and the general public on inland lake and shoreline permitting and various applications proposing work on inland lakes. So projects involving shoreline protection, aeration, diver-assisted suction harvesting, dredging, things like that. Wide variety of projects on inland lakes. And I also participate in various groups and partnerships involving inland lakes statewide, and also am involved in other kind of program development activities. So here's what this afternoon looks like. This is our agenda here. So the first part of today, I'm going to begin talking about some background and importance of natural shorelines. And both Chad Bizzell and I are with Eagle, and we're going to kind of tag team this first half. So I'm going to talk about the background and importance, and then hand it over to Chad to move into looking at how Lake Charlevoix has changed throughout time. So he's going to pull up some really cool data and dive into trends on Lake Charlevoix shorelines and wetlands. And this will kind of, I think, paint a picture of, where we're at and some of the issues that we're facing on Lake Charlevoix. And then we'll take a quick break for questions, and then we'll hand it off to Jennifer Buchanan and Julia Kirkwood, who will talk about some solutions to, maybe some of the issues that we're seeing around Lake Charlevoix. So I'm going to jump right into it and start by just kind of giving everybody a basic overview on the water resources program here at Eagle. So Water Resources Program implements the statutes that regulate areas where land meets water. So this is any type of permitting that's required for inland lakes, streams, wetlands, coastal zone areas, Great Lakes submerged lands, critical dunes, dam safety, a whole bunch of different statutes, but basically anywhere where land meets water. And today I'm going to be focusing on the inland lake shorelines, which are regulated under Part 301 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. So Part 301 in general regulates construction activities in inland lakes and streams. So any kind of dredge, fill, structures on bottomland, on both natural and artificial lakes that are 5 acres or more are going to fall under regulation of Part 301. Also, ponds that are less than 5 acres that are connected to a stream or within 500 feet of another regulating water body. So here's some examples of activities that take place below the ordinary high water mark that are typically regulated under Part 301. So, things like boat ramps, seawalls, docks, bioengineering activities. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on. Some type of vegetation control. So this is a weed roller you can see here that's on bottomlands. Beach sanding, riprap, really anything that takes place below that ordinary high water mark will most likely require a permit with a couple exemptions that I'll get into in a little bit. So it's been a handful of questions about ordinary high water mark lately surrounding Lake Charlevoix. This is the line between upland and bottomland that persists through successive changes in water level so that the character of land is marked distinctly. So you can see here, this is a good example of the ordinary high water mark. You can see this really distinct line between uplands and then the lake bottom where the substrate and the vegetation are distinctly different. This is how this is determined on a site-specific basis under Part 301. I'm not really going to go too much more into the ordinary high water mark on this talk, but this link here, once this presentation is shared as a PDF, this link is live and will take you to a YouTube series that Eagle has done talking about the ordinary high water mark, how to find it, how to transfer it to a different location, and some different types of characteristics, I guess. So I urge you to check that out. But getting back into kind of the regulatory stuff here, there are some exemptions for certain activities under Part 301, seasonal docks, boat hoists, seasonal swimming rafts, any seasonal structure that's placed for private, non-commercial recreational use, as long as it doesn't interfere with use of the water, is going to be exempt. So there are other exemptions in the statute. These are just a few common examples. So another statute that you might run into along inland lake shorelines is Part 303. So this is our wetlands protection statute. So this is required permitting for any activities within wetlands where these are areas where there is a predominance of wetland vegetation, evidence of hydrology, and hydric soils. So I wanted to put this language up here. This is our general permit review criteria that we look at whenever I guess the department is reviewing permit applications under Part 301 and 303. So the department shall not grant a permit if a proposed project will unlawfully impair or destroy waters of the state, or department shall not issue a permit unless adverse impacts to public trust, riparian rights, and the environment will be minimal and a feasible and prudent alternative is available. So I want to dive a little bit more into those ideas of feasible and prudent alternatives here. So the resource program, through these statutes balances public trust with the environment and with riparian rights. So our program is a very collaborative effort with landowners to allow them to exercise their private property rights and to do projects on their property while avoiding and minimizing the impact on our public resources. So we have conversations and work with every applicant on every application, and a denial of an application is an absolute last resort if we can't find some sort of compromise or meet in the middle with a permit applicant on a project to avoid and minimize those impacts to the maximum extent possible so that they can accomplish that basic project purpose. So, we issue a lot of correction requests, this back and forth through MyWaters, our permitting database, on the project purpose part of the application and on the alternatives analysis part of the application. So what we're looking for, I just wanted to provide a little bit of information on what specifically we're looking for in these two pieces of the permit application. So our project summary is the purpose and use. So this is why is the project being proposed. and what is the demonstrated need. So an acceptable project purpose covers what is the cause of the problem, how the project as proposed will solve that problem, and then a summary of the activities surrounding that project. So a lot of examples we get are like these ones right here. You know, we will install a seawall, or we will install rock. And these really aren't preferred. They don't really provide that level of detail and show that demonstrated need. So what we're looking for is kind of this last bullet point at the bottom here, where, you know, protect the shoreline from erosion caused by increased wave energy, maybe from wake boats or something like that, and to provide habitat and water quality benefits. You know, this bioengineering project will diffuse wave energy and, you know, provide habitat and eliminate scour and wave flanking. So that's kind of what we're looking for and in terms of project purpose. And then the alternatives analysis is, you know, really important. So this is, you know, going back to the permit review criteria slide. The department shall not issue a permit unless there are no other less impactful alternatives available. So what Eagle is really looking for here is that rationale and justification. Are there alternate locations, configuration, size, or method to accomplish that same basic project purpose that are less impactful to public trust, riparian rights, and the environment? So, you know, this talk is about shoreline protection. So, you know, these are some unacceptable alternatives analyses here. And then, you know, an acceptable alternatives analysis will address all the other potential alternatives. So if it's a seawall application, for example, what will happen if nothing is done? What will happen if, you know, you install boulders or low slope riprap or bioengineering? So really moving through those alternatives and, you know, providing the department information as to why the project as proposed is the least impactful. So in Michigan, this is kind of the lay of the land in terms of implementing these statutes. So we have this tiered permitting approach. So this system is set up so that the level of impact reflects the extent of the project. So at the very lower end, we have these exempt activities that I mentioned earlier. Then the next step up is these general permit and minor project categories. So we call these MPs and GPs for short. These are really viewed as the resource program best management practices. So these are lists of projects with criteria under each project. And if you can design your project to meet the criteria in the category, it can be processed at a faster rate through, you know, not having that public notice up, and then at a lower fee. So, and this is just the language in the statute that provides for that minor project category creation. I'm not going to go through and read all this. I just wanted to include it for your guys' reference. So now I'm going to jump into kind of the more interesting stuff. We got the regulatory piece out of the way, and I'm going to talk about natural shoreline functions and values. So natural shorelines provide important functions and values. It's functions and values why all of us love our inland lakes in Michigan. You know, nice clear water. They are natural shorelines. The plants along natural shorelines oxygenate the lake. They provide valuable habitats, spawning and nursery areas. These aquatic plants absorb wave energy and stabilize sediments and you know, provide things that we all love about our inland lakes, you know, more of the services. So snorkeling, swimming, fishing, erosion protection, just a ton of different functions and values. These are just a handful that I have pulled out. So, and what we're seeing is that, you know, the simplification of our shorelines through seawall installation and shoreline hardening results in a loss of habitat complexity that can negatively impact fish and wildlife. This is really widely supported by the peer-reviewed literature, and I have some citations underneath each one of these statements that I'm putting up here. You know, this habitat complexity is just critical. We have a ton of species in Michigan that depend on our natural shorelines to complete different stages of their life cycles. And again, the aquatic plants are really important for water quality, competing against algae and invasion resistance. And we also have many species in Michigan of fish and other wildlife that are, like I said, very dependent on our nearshore areas to complete their life cycles and thrive. So I had one of the points I had up on the last slide was talking about habitat heterogeneity. And that's kind of a sciencey term for, I guess, habitat complexity, or, these type of things that I have up on this slide now. So you can see here, this is on the left, this is a low, an area with low heterogeneity. So maybe this is a big monotypic stand of Eurasian water milfoil, for example. And this is an area of high heterogeneity where you have a diversity of plants as well as some open space in the middle. And this is really what we're shooting for. And I really liked this quote from somebody at Mississippi State University saying, an optimal one-size-fits-all habitat is impossible to describe because the parameters of an ideal habitat change based on a variety of factors, right? But the optimal habitat that provides a beneficial environment for most animal populations is one that contains a large diversity of native plants, as well as, I would add to that and say woody structure and really a diversity of habitats in general. So this transition zone is critical. Many species depend on this unobstructed movement between aquatic and terrestrial habitats to complete their life cycles. And I think this figure is really good because it shows that. Here's this line that kind of generalizes the number of species using each one of these three zones. So you have some species that only use the land zone, and maybe they use this transition zone sometimes. And then you have some species that only use the aquatic zone and only use this transition zone sometimes. And then you also have species that are only located in this transition zone. So you get this bump up of abundance and diversity as an increased number of different animals use that transition zone. And so you can see this transition zone is really important, and this is what we're severing when seawalls or hard armoring is installed. And show everybody how this occurs. So here you see these aquatic plants, protecting the shoreline from erosion. There's larger waves coming in, and these aquatic plants bend and move and provide protection, as well as stabilizing those sediments and providing habitat and water quality benefits. And then with seawalls, vertical armoring, you can see you don't get that dissipation of wave energy. You get this hard reflection, and that energy bounces back and is redirected downwards and sideways. So you get suspended sediment, you get a better habitat for aquatic invasive species. And that transition zone that I showed that in the previous slide, that transition zone is now severed. So you're really impacting a wide variety of species with this vertical wall. And here's what this looks like in real life, I guess. So before I play this, I'll give you guys a little bit, make sure my volume's down, give you a little bit of orientation. So here's a seawall in the background, and then this is a bioengineering project. So this is, this low slope, smaller field stone with native Michigan plants planted throughout. And this is an awesome video showing the differences in how these two shoreline protection designs respond in a relatively higher energy environment. So you can see up top this waves just hard reflecting off of that seawall, splashing over, bouncing back. And in this bioengineering project below here, you have this more softer dissipation of wave energy and absorption. You're not getting that hard reflection that's going to be causing that scouring, erosion, and things along those lines. So this is really a preferred method, and we're going to have some speakers later on going into more detail about designs that will work for Lake Charlevoix for those. But so complex habitats provide more ecological niches. With more niches, you get increased richness and diversity, and also increased ecosystem stability in the system, which is perpetuating those functions and values throughout time. And simplified shorelines and heavily controlled aquatic plants can promote lower water quality, and plants compete against algae for nutrients. And when all those plants are removed, lakes can shift toward a more algae dominated state, which results in a loss of these functions and values. So what we're seeing in Michigan broadly is, here's a natural, Michigan lake from Charlevoix County, and, relatively undeveloped. And what we're turning them into is this kind of heavily manicured, kind of suburbanized environments, which they were never really meant to be. And a lot of our species in Michigan aren't adapted to. So these developed shorelines have less woody structure, less vegetation, and less complexity than our undeveloped shorelines. And these are some impacts that we're seeing from vertical armoring, hard armoring around the state. And all these are verified through peer-reviewed research and some Michigan-based studies as well, which I'll get into in a little bit. But we're seeing, like I said, scouring of the lake bottom, sediment suspension, nutrient suspension. These hardened structures don't allow for aquatic plant growth. There's no habitat complexity. They create that barrier for animal movement, and they just remove that natural energy dissipating capacity of a sloped shoreline and that natural vegetation, like I showed in that video on an earlier slide. So, and all of these impacts are really well documented. I like to throw up all the peer-reviewed science, just so everybody has it as a reference. Here's the science. There's so many more papers than these 40 or so that I have up here that discuss the impacts of nearshore development and shoreline armoring and their impacts, both in Michigan and nationwide. So, and it really is about the cumulative impacts, right? The combined impacts of these many smaller projects add up. A single seawall may not have a large impact, but once you get seawalls completely surrounding a lake, or once you have a bunch of completely walled off lakes within a certain region, those cumulative impacts are going to be much worse, so and much more pronounced. So we have more people using our lakes in Michigan, and our lakes are being developed differently, which is resulting in larger cumulative impacts to our shorelines, which can impair those functions and values that I touched on earlier. So our lakefront lots in general have gotten smaller and homes have gotten much bigger. We have this more suburban development style, opposed to kind of this cottage up north style that I have a picture of here. So, and that style does come with some additional impacts to our water bodies. So, we really need to start doing things differently to combat these cumulative impacts resulting from this type of development around our inland lakes, to really perpetuate all those functions and values that previous generations have enjoyed. So, we just need to start using our riparian areas smarter. And part of that is changing how we view shoreline protection. Another piece of this is this National Lakes Assessment. So this is an assessment that's done every 5 years, where the EPA comes in and collaborates with our staff here at Eagle to provide an assessment of our nation's waters. So Michigan does increase its sampling in order to provide more accurate results statewide. Then I think you can guess what the overall biggest threat is here. And it's this lake habitat complexity, which I have been talking about this whole time. So lake habitat complexity, this figure shows that around 50% of our lakes have been categorized in the most disturbed category for lake habitat complexity. Same thing with riparian vegetation cover, and shallow water habitat is almost 40% of our lakes in Michigan have been categorized in the most disturbed category for shallow water habitat, as well as lakeshore disturbance. So this is really kind of alarming, and kind of bolsters our reasoning for wanting to, really promote healthier methods of shoreline protection so we can perpetuate those functions and values throughout time. And with these next figures, I'm kind of drilling down a little bit deeper. But what these figures show is that through time, from 2007 to 2012, we have had our percentage of lakes in this most disturbed category for riparian vegetation cover jump up substantially. And Michigan is, we have more lakes, higher percentage of lakes in the most disturbed category for riparian vegetation cover than we do in our eco-region and nationwide, which is really alarming. We're the Great Lakes state. You know, we should have higher quality lakes than our eco-region and nationwide, in my opinion, but this data is showing otherwise for that indicator. And same thing for the shallow water habitat indicator. Michigan is much worse than our eco-region and nationwide, and has gotten much worse throughout time as well. And then the same trend is also being shown for lakeshore disturbance, both through time and compared to national trends. So, you know, it's kind of alarming. And you know, we've seen this collected data. It's been scientifically documented, like I showed you through that National Lakes Assessment, as well as through peer-reviewed literature. If you recall that slide I had up on all of the peer-reviewed science that is documenting these impacts from shoreline hardening and nearshore development. And so I could show you figures until I'm blue in the face and show you the science, but I really think it's more eye-opening actually seeing what this looks like through some historical imagery. So I'm going to turn this presentation over to Chad Bizzell. He is our GIS specialist in the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams unit. And he's going to show you some on-the-ground trends about how Lake Charlevoix has changed throughout time here. So I'm going to stop sharing right now and hand it over to you, Chad.
Thanks, Eric. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
You're good.
Excellent. Thanks for having me here. I just want to throw my camera on briefly just to introduce myself. My name's Chad Bizzell. Like Eric said, I'm a GIS and remote sensing specialist for the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams program of Eagle. I've been in the program for about 20 years, and generally speaking, the difference between me and most of my counterparts in the resource program is my role is really taking a step back and looking at these resources from the 10,000 foot view, from aerial imagery and other remote sensing data, and trying to get a handle on long-term trends since pre-European settlement. So I've spent quite a bit of time. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And I hope you guys are seeing my slides.
Yep, we can see him.
Excellent. So here we're looking at Lake Charlevoix. I have been essentially scouring the shoreline on Imagery for about the past month, attempting to do a pretty thorough shoreline inventory of armored and non-armored shorelines. Just to give you guys in the community sort of a basis for understanding all of those things that Eric was talking about, really how far we've come on some of these lakes through history. If you can picture, you know, Lake Charlevoix back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when there was really little to no development on the lake. We've seen massive development on this lake since. And through some of the analysis I've done and the data I've generated, we can actually begin to quantify that now. So that's, again, what I'm going to be going through here today. So I'll try and get through this in about a half an hour, leave some time for questions. I will throw out my contact information at the end again, just for reference for you all. But again, Chad Bizzell, EQS, working in the Eagle Water Resources Division. So essentially, one of my main focuses in my work is what we call landscape level resource assessment. So again, backing off the lake and looking at it from sort of the 10,000 foot view with aerial imagery and other remote sensing data, and utilizing that information in a GIS system or a mapping system along with other GIS data layers, things like MyWater's points for permitting, soils data, topography, all that sort of spatial information that we can pull into a GIS system. Now, I always try and give a little bit of a caveat when it comes to this data, though I spent a lot of time essentially trying to interpret every foot of Lake Charlevoix's shoreline. It is a giant water body, and you know, looking at it from imagery at times, you can get a better view in certain situations than others of what you're seeing on the shoreline. But I'm confident, utilizing multiple years of aerial imagery and LiDAR topography information that I've done a pretty thorough inventory of what's on your shoreline at this point. So Eric mentioned the use of historic imagery. For about the last 10 years, we have had in-house at Eagle the MSU Aerial Imagery Archive data. So essentially, this is a collection of imagery that goes back to the 1930s. And there are images for essentially every county in the state and every decade succeeding that. So the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, so on and so forth. So we have a lot of remote sensing aerial imagery to look at to start to understand the trends over time of this lake. In addition to that, we also have a bunch of contemporary imagery that's been flown in the last 10 to 15 years. So for Lake Charlevoix specifically, I had a 2010 springtime image. This was a 2012 springtime image, and then a 2017 spring image. All of these are 1 foot resolution, so really, really good resolution imagery. The resolution really comes down to pixel size. So if I've got 1 foot resolution, each pixel is about a foot by a foot. So that really gives you the ability to get in detail and see things like riprap and seawall. The 2020 image that I used, which will sort of form the basis of the time period we're assessing in the inventory that I've done, is a summer image, leaf on, and a little worse resolution is about 1 meter resolution. So again, the perks of having multiple years of imagery is if I need to see something in summer versus spring from 1 year to the next, I can do that. One of the things that's come on the scene for us remote sensing specialists in the last 5 years or so is the use of LiDAR. LiDAR is essentially an active sensor that's flown above a landscape, shoots millions of laser points down to the ground and collects the return to generate an extremely accurate digital elevation model. So one of the first things I did when I was asked to do the shoreline inventory was pull together a mosaic of all those LiDAR tiles for Lake Charlevoix and seam them together into one seamless digital elevation model. This can get us down to about 1 foot contours on the ground. So highly, highly accurate compared to the sort of 10-foot contours that we used to have on things like USGS topo maps. So just to get in a little bit closer, if we're looking up at the North Shore by Lake Michigan here, you can see just the gradient of elevation change that we can really assess using this data. Really, really useful for us in these sort of landscape level analyses. So one of the things that we can do once we've got this accurate DEM is go ahead and generate, like I said, contours so that we essentially have 1 foot by 1 foot contours for the entire area. This was critically important for the shoreline inventory, mostly because one of my initial issues was I needed a really accurate representation of the shoreline. And using this digital elevation model with 1 foot contours, I was able to then identify that boundary line between land and water, at least at the time that this LiDAR was flown, which was 2017. So you will see at times in the imagery, this line may not line up perfectly with the 2020 imagery just because of water level fluctuation and so forth. But again, this is a very, very accurate shoreline GIS file now that you guys can have access to sort of use as a basis for going ahead and doing these shoreline inventories in the future. So we always want to start by sort of looking at the original land cover for an area. So we use this term pre-settlement. It's really pre-European settlement. And we do actually have a host of information and GIS formats and the like that we can use to assess what was actually on the ground before development began on this lake. So one of the things that we use, and I'll show some examples of these, is the general land office surveys that were done in the early 1800s. So this was an effort largely before Michigan was settled, where surveyors were sent out on the ground to walk section boundaries and assess the resource types, streams, wetlands, lakes that they were seeing within each of those boundaries. Along with each of those section maps comes a set of field notes where the surveyor actually described what they were seeing. So that piece of information that has now been digitized and scanned and we have access to has been turned into by MNFI, the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, a full land cover 1800 data set for Michigan. So many times that serves as the basis for, long before we had roads and, drains and cities built into the landscape, what did the landscape contain in terms of resources? And then we also make use of hydric soils information. Again, soils are unique in that once they've been inundated with water for a period of time, the signs of those will last essentially forever. And those have been mapped by NRCS and soil scientists statewide at this point. So between those three pieces of information, we have a pretty good assessment, a pretty good picture of what this lake looked like circa 1800. So this is just a quick example of what Lake Charlevoix, again, up on the north end by Lake Michigan, looked like on these actual survey maps. So you can see in places streams flowing into the lake. We do actually have a layer of all these original stream courses that we've generated and can provide to you as well. So really, this next layer was derived from those GLO survey maps. So this is a quick snapshot of what the MNFI 1800 land cover map looks like. So this is a very, very interesting layer, very, very cool if you've never had the chance to look at it. They have a statewide atlas that you can purchase from them. But essentially, they broke the entire landscape down by land cover class in these sort of general categories that you see below. These are really just the wetland categories that I'm showing here. Because again, I was particularly interested in being able to assess original wetland shoreline on Lake Charlevoix pre-development. So you can see we have a predominance of cedar swamp in this area. I'm sure those of you that live on and near the lake are very familiar with those areas. Lots of mixed conifer and cedar swamp, even back in the 1800s. So add to that the yellow areas there, which is our hydric soils. And you can see that I have a pretty good basis for understanding where the wetland complexes were pre-European settlement. So using all of that, I was able to use that LiDAR-derived shoreline boundary to go in and assess total wetland shoreline along Lake Charlevoix pre-European settlement. So we really, again, I think have a pretty decent basis here for what was there originally, and thus can assess what has been done since. So to look at the stats of that, originally Lake Charlevoix had about 37 miles of wetland shoreline. It is a very large lake, but there are some very large cedar swamp complexes that still border the lake. But obviously through some of the processes that Eric has talked about already, much of that connection to those wetland areas has been severed. So looking at this from a percentage standpoint, obviously we have, significantly more wetland shoreline than we did upland originally, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 56 to 44% here in the orange. So now that we've been able to assess original resource condition for the lake, then I had to turn to let's assess what's there now on the most current imagery available to us. So at the point that I started this, we have as our most recent imagery, NAPE 2020 imagery, which comes from NRCS. Again, it's summertime imagery, so we don't have that leaf off condition on the imagery that we prefer to do this type of interpretation. But again, I had multiple other years of leaf off spring imagery to use as well. The other thing that I used as sort of part and parcel to this process was we have all of our MyWaters permitting locations now available in sort of a spatial format where I can get essentially a point on the map along with information on that point in terms of what sort of armoring or natural shoreline development has occurred and been permitted there by Water Resources Division. So using those two sets of information, again, I feel like I've done a pretty thorough job. And I think this is going to be quality information for you guys going down the road. So just to talk a bit about the imagery that I used. Again, if you look on the left here, we've got some spring leaf off imagery. I've turned that into the color infrared look and feel, which gives us a better idea for sort of underlying hydrology and wetland condition. And you can see in this instance, I can see significantly back further into the actual forest bordering the lake that I can on, say, the 2020 leaf on image where you've got obviously tree canopy sort of obscuring your view. So these were the two major imagery data sets that I used for this interpretation. And in all places, I attempted to keep everything current to the 2020 imagery. So just to give you some examples of what these armoring types look like on imagery, these are some examples of riprap or, toe stone thrown down onto the shoreline into the water, to do things like prevent erosion for aesthetics, what have you. Riprap is generally very obvious on things like aerial imagery because it is so bright white. Usually riprap, again, is light in tone and reflects a lot of light back to the sensor, which makes it really stand out. And in the case of riprap, when you're comparing it to something like a seawall, you will actually see the individual rock on something like riprap. They tend to be wider footprints, and you can actually get a feel for some texture there, that there's some individual rocks there. So in certain cases, looking at an example like this, I had some MyWaters data that there had been some riprap placed here in 2020. Not quite as obvious in the individual rock, but very potentially, some smaller rock that was used there, so it doesn't stand out quite as well on that summer imagery. So just a few more examples here. You can kind of see in the color infrared imagery, the same property. And again, the strong white reflectance that jumps out at you when you've got a shoreline that's been, straightened, hardened, etc. So the other thing I tried to call out in this inventory was seawalls. Seawalls are different in terms of how they appear on imagery in comparison to riprap, if only because there's not that texture of those individual rocks. So you tend to see, big straight structures, concrete seawalls, wood seawalls, coming out as these really straight edges. Mother Nature does not typically create anything that's straight. An unmodified shoreline often looks very not straight, very random. So when you're looking at things like a seawall, we're seeing straightened shorelines, straight edges, and many times typically some sort of structure that's keeping and maintaining that line. So to get into some of the non-armoring examples that I tried to focus on, this one to me potentially being the most important for sort of future permitting and future efforts for where to prioritize contacting property owners for best management practices, that sort of thing, is this developed category. So when I labeled something developed, essentially what I was looking for was residential development or roads that essentially bordered the lake. So you had mowed lawns or docks, not seawalls, docks or other structures, decks that were bordering the lake very, very closely. So in those instances where I detected that without an armoring, some sort of armoring on the shoreline, I called it developed. So to me, many times these areas are surrounded, by riprap or by seawall, and the individual property owner at this point, at least, has decided not to have armoring. However, just with the maintenance of a mowed lawn, docks and things like that, there has been some impact to the shoreline. So that's a class to pay attention to as we move forward here. Obviously, because we mapped pre-settlement wetland shoreline, I attempted to capture all the existing wetland shorelines circa 2020. And again, these sort of fall into some similar categories. This is what we're seeing as sort of a lowland conifer swamp on the 2017. Again, these are very, very identifiable on aerial imagery, especially in color infrared, because they just have this dark understory of moisture that tends to stand out really well in the imagery, along with, obviously, when you've got a spring off image and you're seeing all this red biomass, those are coniferous type trees. The other thing I saw quite a bit of was these outlet streams, coming from the upland heading lakeward. So there's several of these in the data set where I tried to capture that sort of upward migration of water into the stream. And then obviously many times you'll get a wetland pocket at the outlet to the lake. So again, those are areas I would have designated wetland. And then things like your classic emergent wetland sort of bordering the lake, providing that buffer from wave action and erosion like Eric had talked about earlier. So there's a wetland class in the inventory as well. And then finally, we did have some situations where we had natural shoreline that was not wetland. So that's essentially what is the upland category that's still, available on the lake to you. So, these areas where you have something that's not been armored, doesn't have heavy development on it, yet is not a wetland, got called natural or upland in this case. So, and you can see in the LiDAR DEM, this is actually the same property in 3 different shots here. You've got houses very near the lake here, but you've got a very, very steep slope where there isn't that big wide sort of wetland, area bordering the lake. And then again, the same area in summertime imagery. So the MyWater's permit location data that I had was current through the end of 2020. So you can see, just looking at the sort of general overview map on the left there, where the concentration of permitting has occurred. And this goes back essentially as far as our record keeping goes. So this could include permits for seawalls or riprap that were done 15 to 20 years ago, as well as everything current to 2020. So there were many instances where, some of these projects had been permitted, say, in October of 2020. I know we had a bunch of high water issues going on at that time. But because it was done in October and this imagery was flown in July, that was not apparent on the imagery. So where I had that type of situation, I attempted to at least put in a riprap or a seawall feature based on what the permitting point was telling me. So that also greatly informed the overall shoreline inventory as I was working through this. So this is the end result, which is a fully classified shoreline line derived from LiDAR that basically breaks the entire shoreline down into these classes. So I've given you some examples already of some of these. I didn't have all the time to go through all of them. But again, because this is a GIS data set, this can be shared with you guys. It can be updated as new imagery becomes available. In fact, there's 2022 Charlevoix imagery being flown this spring that we should have available to us by the end of the year. Like I said earlier, that leaf off spring imagery is a better resolution and really will give us a great view of the shoreline in most places around Lake Charlevoix. So, in terms of future steps, that may be something we can talk about, which is updating as we go to this newer imagery and keeping this sort of temporal so that we can track overall cumulative impacts and status and trends to the lake. So if we break down the stats from this, again, just in sort of pie chart form here, you can see that really our 2 most dominant shorelines on the lake in terms of armoring are your seawalls and your riprap. There is a significant chunk of developed land that has not been armored yet, but still is having some impact on the shoreline. And then you look at activities like beach sanding below the ordinary high and things like that, still occupying a great percentage of the shoreline in total. So, this is something that should be pretty accurate, like I said, because I use that LiDAR derived water boundary. The measurement should be, essentially down to the foot or less. And it's again, I think probably the most comprehensive shoreline inventory that we've ever undertaken at Eagle for trying to get a handle on what sorts of armoring and non-armoring we're seeing on a particular inland lake. So again, all this data can be, cookie cuttered up in any way that, you guys see fit. Because it's GIS based, it's something that we can share and keep current for hopefully many years to come. So just looking at the overall, armored shoreline versus not armored, again, really the armored category is encompassing riprap and seawalls with beach sand in front. And what you can see is that essentially we've already gone around that lake and armored over half of the total shoreline. And again, when you start to think of, the sorts of impacts that on a site specific scale you can have when you've armored one property, you can only imagine the sorts of impacts that we've had when we've armored almost half the lake. So looking from a cumulative impact perspective, the shoreline of this lake has been heavily impacted through time. and I'm sure will continue to be. The question is, what sort of methods will we use moving forward to do that in a more sustainable way? So if we look at the wetland shoreline status and trends, for my pre-settlement data, we had, like I said, about 36 to 37 miles of wetland shoreline. That encompassed about almost 60% of the total shoreline. We now have essentially the opposite, where we've got almost 60% of the shoreline is armored. But wetlands specifically, you still have buffering wetlands around about 10.2 miles of the lake, which still occupies about 16% of the total shoreline. But again, you've only got about 28% of the original wetland shoreline that you had. And really, when you start to look at that from the viewpoint of Eric and the things that he talked about, the wetland loss really does equal a loss of ecological services. Those wetlands are providing storm buffer and flood storage and sediment retention and nutrient retention. And that sort of loss of wetland shoreline truly has a cumulative impact on the lake itself overall. So next steps for this, I think I've covered some of them already. Again, this new data set that we'll be getting from our Michigan Imagery solution, the 2022 leaf off, is going to be excellent imagery for this type of work. So I'd be curious to revisit some of this once that imagery is in-house to see how things have changed. I know there's been some mention of some on the water surveys that have been done, where you've actually quantified armoring and non-armoring from a boat with a GPS. Certainly that data can be incorporated into my shoreline inventory to essentially rectify it to on the ground conditions wherever possible. There will be, I'm sure, future LiDAR data collection. Like I said, the last LiDAR for Charlevoix was done in 2017, but I'm guessing within 5 or 10 years, there will be another flight of LiDAR done at an even better quality. So again, looking at the resolution of that data, you can really see some of those hardened shorelines very clearly when you've got that sort of quality topography. And then obviously we're continuing to log permitting data in my waters for every permit that's issued on Lake Charlevoix. So we've already got another 2 years of data that haven't been included in this particular analysis. So that's certainly something that could be addressed down the road as well. So that, I think, is all the slides that I had. Hopefully that was eye-opening in terms of, looking at the total cumulative impacts of all these little individual projects on the overall lake. I really think there's probably a lot of application for this data, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you guys up there in the region and hopefully using it to good effect to change some of these trends in the long term. So I guess with that, am I kicking it back to Eric or Ryan, perhaps?
Thanks, Chad. Awesome work. This is really great. What a great resource for Lake Charlevoix and other folks to use. So we're going to kind of move into some questions here, I think, and take a short break. I just like to say, with that data that Chad has presented, it's obvious that cumulative impacts of shoreline hardening, are significant. And, we've reached a point now in Michigan where the education and technology and infrastructure has made less impactful alternatives widely available and achievable in a wide variety of situations on inland lakes in Michigan. So I think we can take a short break and take some questions now, and then I'm going to pass the mic on over to Jennifer Buchanan with Tip at the Mitt Watershed Council to talk about some alternative methods of shoreline protection that are a little more sustainable than these vertical walls and shoreline hardening that we've been seeing. So yeah, we can handle any questions now. And I guess I'd like to also introduce Ann Garwood and Joe Haas. Ann is the supervisor for the Wetlands, Lakes and Streams Unit, and Joe Haas is the supervisor for the Gaylord Cadillac District Office. And yeah, we'd be happy to address any questions in the chat here.
Sure. Eric, I wanted to bring up a couple questions that came up. So the first one might be for Chad. Chad, can you just talk about, have we done this for other lakes? Is this information available for other lakes? And give a little bit of insight into that, please.
Sure. So we started this sort of shoreline analysis technique on Gun Lake down in Berry County about 10 years ago. And at that time, there was a permit application in for a seawall that was looking to armor essentially the last natural piece of shoreline in one particular part of the lake. And the district supervisor at the time thought it would be useful to look at overall wetland upland trends over time and see the loss that had occurred. That was very generalized in the sense that it was really just a wetland upland analysis. So I can say, I think without dispute, that this is by far the most in-depth shoreline inventory we've ever done. It did take a considerable amount of time, obviously, to do the interp, but you know, when you look at the time and the cost and the resources needed to do an on the ground or on the water inventory, you're still saving yourself a lot of work doing it from this remote scale. So yeah, this is really a first for us. You know, it'll take some discussion to see where we go with this down the line in terms of other lakes, but you know, something that I think is useful enough that it certainly could be a tool in our toolbox from here on.
So Eric and maybe Joe too, can you guys talk a little bit about, obviously there has been a lot of shoreline impacts on Lake Charlevoix over the years, and some of the efforts that Eagle is making on our side in the regulatory program. Can you just sort of reiterate some of the things that we've been working on to address shoreline issues statewide, and you know how that applies to Lake Charlevoix, and then also touch on how is that incorporated into our permit reviews?
Sure, I can take a first stab at it and then hand it over to you, Joe, if you like. I think this is a big challenge for a lot of inland lakes around Michigan. You know, we have this large history of seawalls across the state and really across the region. And kind of changing people's ideas of shoreline protection isn't something that happens overnight. It happens through continual education over time. So efforts like this is, I think, the second or third larger webinar that we've done on bioengineering and shoreline protection and things like that. Trying to educate people, in my opinion, is the most important thing. Every year we do, with the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, we do contractor trainings where we try and teach contractors these type of more sustainable techniques. This year we've upped the demonstration projects to 3 demonstration projects around the state. Additionally through time, Eagle has also kind of changed our, tweaked our minor project categories that I've talked about, where, we've been taking steps to kind of turn this ship around a little bit. And kind of make better choices with this large history of nearshore development that we have in Michigan. But again, these type of changes don't happen overnight, and they happen mainly through education. So I guess towards that end, we've also been working on a story map, which over the next couple of weeks, you'll be seeing some advertising out through the same channels that you heard about this webinar through. So this will be, and I'll be touching on that story map a little bit later on today, as well as on our shoreline protection website. We have a ton of new fact sheets and information on different methods that are available to more sustainably protect your shorelines. So I think I maybe answered that question, but Joe, if you want to fill in any gaps I missed.
Yeah, I would add, welcome everybody. Thanks for your participation. I would think with the amount of participants we have, we sort of talked internally that, we would expect this is, probably relatively statewide representation from the attendees. So thank you for your interest. Lake Charlevoix is the 3rd largest lake in the state, connected to Lake Michigan. So it's got unique challenges. And I think there's also some very unique resources worth protecting out here. We recognize that. Chad mentioned the idea of ecosystem services when it comes to specifically to wetlands, but really for all the services that shorelands provide, the lake provides, not just wetlands, but including wetlands. And these are services that are provided for free, right? We're not paying for these services, but I think I've had this discussion with multiple people in the course of sort of, as Eric suggested, we're turning the corner on being more protective. Is as shoreline owners, you not just have a right, riparian rights, but you have a responsibility, right? And so that's a difficult discussion oftentimes with somebody who's proposing an impacting project that's gonna, that they have already got a design in mind. They want a large rock wall, and that seems to be in vogue right now on Lake Charlevoix, and we've permitted plenty of those, probably too many, admittedly. But we've got tools now that we are completely adept at using. There's simple tools that even applicants can use regarding shoreline energy calculators, and just looking at the existing science. The state of the science is there. These are areas that are worth protecting. We need to protect them now and make those positive developments in our permit review with the backstop of the regulation in mind. We have limited ability, to some degree. We as long as we're acting under the with the backstop of the regulation, we're in a good place, but we need to, we can't overreach. And I'm wandering a little bit with my thoughts, but the idea being is we are, I think, becoming more protective. We don't tend to deny a lot of projects, but that's because we get people to adapt and modify and adjust their projects so they're permittable. Permittable being less impacting to the resource, to avoid minimize impacts to the resource to the greatest extent possible. So the ones we do deny, it's usually because an applicant is locked into a project and they're not willing to play the alternatives game, if you will, or to consider any alternatives. That's certainly within the rights, and we run plenty of projects through the due process of regulation and end up in contested cases all the time. It's not ideal. The ideal situation is somebody who proposes something and then realizes if they modify it, they maybe don't need a permit, and they can avoid dealing with us and still get something along their property that works for them. So I think, just again, the idea of the services provided out here on these shorelines, the ecosystem services are important, and they're provided for free. And again, as shoreline owners, you have we're going to be pushing that you got not only a right, but a responsibility to do the right thing. So thanks again.
And I'd also like to add too, I mentioned this in my talk as well, that, we're at a point now where there are more alternatives available for shoreline protection now than what there were maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago. The shoreline restoration technology has drastically improved over that period of time and is still improving. And every year we are having more and more demonstrated bioengineering projects and projects using softer techniques installed on the ground in Michigan. So that affects that alternatives analysis, and that's part of this turning the corner that Joe had mentioned. So it's just that availability of other alternatives that have been demonstrated, especially in higher energy areas like Lake Charlevoix.
Oh, Ryan, do we have time for more questions here, or should we hold them till the end?
We have time some more. We have time for some more. We're at, what is it, about 2 o'clock? I think we're scheduled, for about another 20 minutes for questions and break. It depends on how long, if and how long you want to break for, or if you want to give it a couple more minutes and then move on.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions, so I'll try and grab a couple more. One that's a little different than some of the others is, what about the use of things like offshore wave attenuation devices or sand nourishment? Can you guys talk a little bit about those types of projects?
I could speak to one that's in mind right now that's been a large project. It's not in our district, but I think that the concern with those is they're often, they occupy a large footprint, or can occupy a large footprint, where when we're talking about projects in the water, you've got to keep your proposal and your work within your riparian interest area, within those sort of pseudo property lines, if you will, and the impacts as well. So these things can impact fisheries. They can be large and in their footprint and prevent, anglers, prevent navigation and recreational boating. So I'm not sure about the sand nourishment aspect of that. And I don't know, maybe other staff can speak to that, but in my experience, it's more like the footprint and the physical occupation of public trust waters that causes a problem with the wave attenuation devices, including some fisheries impacts as well, depending on how deep they're designed.
And I'll add, and I'll share my screen here too. We've had, you guys can see my screen, right? We've had a couple projects in Michigan now install shoreline woody structure. There's been a couple larger projects around with the goals of providing habitat and trying to kind of intercept wave energy using crowns of trees out into the water, before those waves interact with the actual shoreline. And these are kind of the designs that we're trying to promote. And these this illustration and plan packages are posted up on our shoreline protection website. I have the links here in this presentation once it's shared for that. But the general idea is using whole trees and securely affixing them to the shoreline. And again, to go along with Joe was saying, making sure they're not going over your neighbor's riparian interest areas or anything like that. But these are great things that can be installed in areas where there's appropriate energy level to handle them and really provide great amount of habitat. So it's something to consider for your property.
I guess another question that's come up a couple of times in a little bit different ways is for the people left who do not have seawalls or do not have armored shorelines, sort of what's the motivation for them to continue protecting those areas, especially if they are starting to experience erosion and have concerns about their property? And can you talk a little bit about that?
So the question was, why protect a natural shoreline?
Sorry, some of the people who don't have seawalls or hardened shorelines yet, right, they're a little frustrated with how much hardened shoreline there has been over the years. And so what's the incentive for them to continue protecting those areas, especially if they are starting to see erosion on their property and they want to protect it? Why should they use these BMPs, I think, instead of also trying to do hard armoring the way we've been talking about?
Sure. Yeah, I think using these BMPs, and let me share my screen again because I have a few slides continuing on in my presentation that kind of go over this a little bit better. So,
While you call that up, I could talk. I don't know. So I would suggest that it could be the cost. It's less expensive to have a natural shoreline. The nature of them being self-healing once they're established. You have ice push or wave damage, it tends to self-heal, and again, that doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to bring equipment in or hire somebody to come in and repair it necessarily. I'll let you go now, Eric.
Sure. Yeah. So, like Joe was saying, these are really adaptive solutions, and going back to some earlier slides in my talk, the idea is to absorb and to dissipate that wave energy and not have that hard reflection that you get with seawalls. So, installing large rock or installing vertical structures, you're going to have all of those negative water quality and habitat impacts that I talked about earlier in my talk. So I think, the motivation for people would be to, preserve all those functions and values that we all enjoy on our inland lakes. And, there's a variety of different solutions that are available and with, I guess, the end goal being, that absorption and dissipation of wave energy in addition to providing that habitat. So, what we're seeing in a lot of areas is, with these lower slope revetments like this is a higher energy bioengineering project design. And this design corresponds to our minor project category. So again, those are those expedited permitting categories that have minimal impacts on the resource. So what this higher energy design entails, and I'm going to steal a little bit of Jen Buchanan's thunder here, sorry, Jen, but basically there's this low slope riprap using smaller rock. The category allows for 18-inch maximum diameter rock. In many cases and many lakes around the state, you don't even need to get that large. But the idea is, you know, again, to dissipate that wave energy, but also in areas where there's ice push, you know, the ice just gently rides up this riprap and then breaks off. You don't get that hard impact of ice jacking and things like that where you have this vertical wall. So, you know, in many areas, this is really going to be a preferred option, you know, for that reason, as well as providing habitat. And, you know, to be honest, at least in my opinion, it just looks a lot prettier and a lot nicer. You know, I think a lot of people move on to inland lakes because, you know, they love the water, and especially up north, you love that up north feel. And, you know, especially Lake Charlevoix, you know, it's, you know, bringing some of those I guess aspects back would be a driver. So yeah, I'll save the rest of it for Jen's talk, but you know, there's a wide variety of different designs and techniques that are available.
All right, it is just about 2:15. We're slated to kind of start our next round of presentations at 2:30. But we can go ahead and start that early if you'd like, and just go ahead and push on. I'm not sure that we need more time for break, but
That sounds good.
do that too. All right, I think next up is Jennifer Buchanan. Eric, did you want to do any introduction before we get started with the next couple presentations, or next few?
Sure, yeah, so these next couple presentations are gonna provide some of the solutions. I think in this first part of this webinar, we kind of went over, you know, the current lay of the land, what some of the issues are, what are some of the specific problems around Lake Charlevoix that we're seeing. And, you know, Jennifer Buchanan and Julia Kirkwood are gonna present some ways that we can kind of move forward in a more sustainable manner and you know, kind of pick out issues individually on your own properties that, you know, you can evaluate and make some changes to. So yeah, take it away, Jen.
All right, thank you, Eric. Let me see if I can share my screen.
All right, and it looks like we're not seeing the presentation. So we're seeing like the
Yeah, you guys warned me about this. I told you I'd panic. One moment. No.
yeah, there's a little bit of slowdown on our end. You might just need to try to reshare with another screen.
Oh. Let's see.
If you John, try unsharing it and then reshare the screen. There you go.
Told you I'd do this. That's not in the Is that
Nope,
the right view?
It
Yep.
looks like the right view. You got it.
Whew. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jen Buchanan. I'm the Associate Director with Tip of the Mint Watershed Council. And thanks for tuning in today. And I'm really excited to see so many people and their interest in this program. So thank you to Eagle for including us today. What I'm going to talk about is basically some of the things that the Tip of the Mint Watershed Council has been promoting for years, which is natural shorelines and what we call biotechnical erosion control or bioengineering. Just in case you're not fully familiar with our organization, Tip of the Mint Watershed Council was formed in 1979. We are a nonprofit based in Petoskey, but our service area extends throughout the northern tip of the Lower Peninsula. We work in 4 major watersheds, including the Sheboygan River watershed, the Little Traverse Bay watershed, the Lake Charlevoix watershed, and the Elk River chain of lakes watershed. While we're a nonprofit, we do have a membership base that helps support our work, and we're also funded by a lot of grants that allow us to support water resources in a number of capacities, including restoration, water quality monitoring, science, water education, and policy and advocacy. So I'm going to talk about basically a little bit of the origin of our program with biotechnical erosion control or bioengineering, where we began, give you some case studies. Hopefully that'll help those listening today understand a little bit more about what goes into a successful shoreline restoration project. So in 1995, our biotechnical erosion control program began with about 180 feet on 2 adjoining properties on Crooked Lake, which is in Emmett County. One of our staff members at that time was working with the property owner to try to understand how they could prevent further erosion and loss of their shoreline. The property had been in the family for about 70 years. They'd been documenting at least 6 inches of shoreline loss about every year. It was determined that the removal of the native vegetation along the shoreline, there were a few large trees remaining, but those were not enough basically to fortify the shoreline. They've been mowing to the water's edge. And of course, being where it's at on the inland waterway, there was a lot of boat traffic. The soils were highly erodible. So a number of factors went into why this shoreline was eroding so severely over the decades. So in fact, the turf was slumping so much that there was about 4 feet in some areas of undercut bank. So the property owner was very much in support of pursuing a project that would, provide them a more resilient shoreline and also offer a lot of habitat that had been lost over the years. So again, in 1995, through a grant with the Great Lakes Commission, our staff worked to design and install a shoreline erosion control project. So the upper left picture there is basically some of the crew at the time installing what is known as a coir log and some light armoring of field stone, and then a few boulders to act as wave breaks. Over the years, with about 10 to 15 feet of green belt, we augmented with different species throughout the years. They refrained from mowing. The shoreline has recovered really nicely, no more soil erosion. And so that's where it is today. Also, as part of that project, my predecessor authored a book Understanding Living with and Controlling Shoreline Erosion, which the 3rd edition has been printed. And it is available on our website. If you go to watershedcouncil.org and look for restoration, you'll see the PDF available for download. It's over 100 pages, I think. It's a little technical, but it's a great resource, and it's what we use as the basis for all of our projects. Okay, so the key things about what makes a successful shoreline bioengineering project on a high energy lake. So earlier you heard about kind of low energy, high energy. In Northern Michigan, most of our lakes are what are considered to be high energy systems. So coir logs, hence when coir logs alone aren't enough. Coir logs are basically, coir is the fiber from a coconut. So like the scratchy doormats that you can buy at a Home Depot, that's that same fiber, but it's compressed into a linear log, 12, 16, or 20 inches in diameter, and typically 10 feet long, and it's encased in a jute mesh of sorts. So it's biodegradable, but it's permanent enough that it allows, when installed properly, to prevent further erosion and allow plant materials to become established immediately behind it. So we couple coir logs with fieldstone. So it's not oversized rock, not boulders, but fieldstone. So basically the rounded rocks of varying sizes that are glacial relics that we find in this area due to the glaciers. So, so a few key things about this diagram is the slope. Again, it was mentioned earlier. Really, the ideal slope is 1 foot vertical to 4 feet horizontal. You can, in some situations, go a little steeper for about 1 foot vertical to 3 feet horizontal, but ideally, we're looking at a 1-on-4 slope. You can see in the diagram, the toe stone is labeled. It's typically the largest fieldstone of all of the stones, and it's partially embedded in the lake bottom. Usually pick a stone out of the pile that's got the right configuration, it's got a bit of a slope, because you want that wave energy to break at that point. And if it's sticking up out of the lake bottom, it's gonna act almost like a mini seawall. So that toe stone also helps hold the revetment between that and the coir log in place. So the toe stone placement and how it's embedded in the lake bottom is critical. The fieldstone size and composition. A lot of people think that, the bigger the stone, the better, but that is not typically true. The fieldstone, in this case, you want to have rock that is big enough to stay in place, but also small enough that it's somewhat mobile. So the idea is that these rocks act as ball bearings, in particular when it comes to ice, so that the ice can ride up and down that slope, and those rocks facilitate that ice movement. The coir elevation. So you don't want the coir to be sitting too high out of the lake or too low so that it's submerged. And so it should fall about halfway. Again, the ordinary high water mark about halfway along the elevation of the coir log. Filter layer. A lot of contractors like to use a non-woven geotextile or landscape fabric underneath a shoreline project, but we encourage as a better alternative what we call filter layer with a combination of pea stone and drain stone. What that provides is a way to, a bed to situate the fieldstone on top. And, but yet it also allows plant materials to become established, because again, the idea is not to have this rock stay as it is, but actually provide support or a foundation for plant materials to become established within it. And of course, the native plants, having a green belt immediately behind the coir log is critical. A lot of property owners want maybe to do the coir log and the fieldstone, but not the plantings. And that is highly discouraged, because the plantings and their deep roots are going to be what becomes the backbone of the shoreline. It's going to, those root systems are going to kind of move into the coir log over time as it's degrading, about 7 to 10 years. And that's really the strength of the shoreline that we're trying to recreate. So installation techniques may vary, but not all are equal. So this picture I've used for a long time, but I appreciate it because it shows a crew that is hand placing to some extent the fieldstone. You want the fieldstone to be somewhat knit together. There are obviously going to be some voids in between the fieldstone, which is important, but you don't want big voids. Small voids will provide habitat for macroinvertebrates. But if there's the right size, then wave energy as it comes across that cannot migrate soil out from below it. So really kind of knitting it together, hand placing to some extent, fieldstones is an important aspect of a good installation. So the fieldstone, I get the question a lot of how big or how small. And we have used a basic formula over the years, again, developed back in the 90s based on an extensive literature search of how to determine the best rock size for a given location. So the first thing you need to know is the fetch. So the fetch is basically the open water area that the wind can blow across unimpeded to a given location. So on Lake Charlevoix, I believe the longest fetch would be about 13 miles. And that is compared to, lakes downstate, a lot more. Hence, this is why we're dealing with high energy systems. Torch Lake, I think, has up to 17 linear miles of fetch. Burt and Mullet about 10 miles. So big, wide open areas for the wind to blow to create waves to affect shorelines. So you can measure fetch in Google Earth or Google Maps quite easily. And that's, step number one. What's the distance or the fetch? Wind speed. You'll see that has an asterisk. What, again, my predecessor determined was that using a wind speed, average sustained wind speed of 35 miles per hour in our region is a good number to use. So could be higher, could be a little lower, but 35 is kind of the magic number we've used for years. So when you combine that 35 mile per hour plus your fetch for your given location, that's going to determine what we call the significant wave height. I put the diagram there because I use that term significant wave height, and I don't think I ever quite explained what that means, but it's the distance between the top or the wave crest and the bottom or the wave trough. So what we then, once you know that or understand that table on the right-hand side, again, it's pretty coarse as far as the values go, but it's a good ballpark to aim for. So that if you're looking at an average sustained overwater wind speed of 35 miles per hour, and on the left-hand side, you can see the fetch, then you can scroll across there and determine your significant wave height. So I've highlighted the 35 mile per hour column, and the fetch varies again according to your site. And so you can try to anticipate then what that significant wave height will be for your given location. So then once you know that, this table also included in that book, the shoreline erosion book, you can determine what basically the median rock size for your site should be. So significant wave height on the left-hand side. I disregard for the most part the rock weight column. I just look at the rock diameter in inches. And that gives me the ballpark for, again, the median rock size that you're going to need for your site. Again, because of our big lakes with extensive fetches, usually in that median rock size of 6 to 9 inches. So once you know your median, then you want to basically have rocks, not all one size. They need to be a variety of sizes, some smaller, some larger. And so I take that median size and I basically divide or multiply by 1.5 and also by 0.5 to determine the max and the minimum. And then when you go to, or your contractor goes to determine the volume, overall volume of these field stones, try to aim for about 50% of that median size, 25% larger and 25% smaller. Again, having that variety of sizes is really critical. You don't want all the rocks to be one single size. Oh, there's my arrow. And again, this book helps explain it. So I do encourage you to check it out. Okay, fieldstone. As I mentioned earlier, that top layer really acts like ball bearings. So this is a good example on Douglas Lake, on a shoreline on the west side that gets beat up probably more than any shoreline in our service area. So you can see how that ice is beginning to advance landward, and that gentle slope and those rocks, as it's moving, it's starting to break upward. And that 4-on-1 slope, you can see it's pretty gentle. And also the organic debris, so leaves and sticks and sand and sediment that accumulates in the spaces or the voids in between the fieldstone is really important. People oftentimes want to keep that clean and tidy, and that's counter to what you want. You want that organic material to accumulate in those spaces because that's what's going to help build soil and allow plants to become established. So I'm going to walk through a few of our projects that we've done over the years in our service area. This one is on Burt Lake. The location is down near Indian River, so that southeast area. So the fetch was about between 6 and 7 miles. I determined significant wave height, above 6.5, somewhere in there, feet. The average rock size was, pretty significant for this location. So about 11 inches. The smallest we determined would be about 5.5 inches, and the largest 16.5 inches. So using those numbers, see on the left-hand side, the shoreline, and it had a pretty decent green belt to begin with, but again, there's so much boat traffic through here. So a lot of exposed roots, which we did not want to compromise any more than we had to. So keeping those as intact as we could. You can see on the right-hand side during installation, the coir log is kind of tucked up underneath some of the roots. And then we use sand and more pea stone as backfill material behind the coir log. Again, this is during, you can see that filter layer, which is drain stone and pea stone, that was laid down first along the entire length of the coir log. And then we start basically filling in the larger field stone and layers above that. So in the foreground, you can see that filter layer, and then we're advancing on that far edge there with the field stone, bringing it further along. And this was immediately after installation. So you can see then we've top dressed the revetment with, you know, whatever smaller stones can help kind of settle into some of those voids on the top. So I do want to be clear that the best designs and installations doesn't always go the way that you hope it will. And so this was a site on Douglas Lake on the northern shoreline. After one winter, this is what we discovered in the spring. What we determined was probably the slope of the revetment after it was installed was too steep. So it's hard to control every variable, but certainly sticking with those key components that I had in that diagram is going to be your best chance of success. And it was a particularly harsh winter. This was restored and has not had any issues since. So. Okay, this is one of my favorite projects that we did on Intermediate Lake, which is part of the Elk River chain of lakes. We had a grant to help do a demonstration project. The property owner was very much in support of trying to create a more natural shoreline. The property had, as you can see, some concrete that had deteriorated over time. Some things like cinder blocks had been thrown in to try to fortify it, but they had been continuing for the most part to mow to the water's edge. So it was a fairly short distance, 70 linear feet. So we used 7 10-foot long, 16-inch diameter coir logs. Given the location, we needed an average stone size of about 8 inches. The smallest would be about 4, the largest 12. It was about 20 to 25 cubic yards of field stone, and the fetch for this particular location was about 3 miles. So still high energy, but not nothing like 13 or 17 miles. Again, here's some pictures. I do want to point out on the left-hand side, this point up here is the adjoining property owner's land. And they have lost about 9 feet since this photo was taken. They do not have any sort of shoreline treatment there, so they continue, this point continues to wear down while the property that we worked on continues to be stable. Again, these concrete chunks needed to come out. And here's the property that we worked on. You can see that point still eroding in the distance. The project was installed in November of 2011, so the contractors weren't real happy with me to be having to hand place the toe stone, which they're doing in that upper left-hand picture. And what they've done here along the top of the coir log is basically pull the largest field stones from the delivered material, setting those aside so they can be used for that field toe stone. Here's me walking along the top of the coir log. Part of it is you really do want the top elevation of the coir log to be level as it can be. You don't want any sags or humps in it. So that was just me just feeling, assessing basically that it was at the right elevation and that it was consistent across the top. So this is still under construction in this photo. And so that again was installed in 2011. Here on the left-hand side is 2014. You can see a lot of plants. We had a nice palette of plants that we used, native plants, some cultivars just for some of their more showy properties. So everything's become established. You can see also the fieldstone has kind of settled and migrated. And that's okay. That's what we would like it to do. It's still very stable. On July 2019, you can see again, in this case, a lot of sand between 14 and 19 has built up into that area. And again, that point of the adjoining property continues to wear down. And this is a still from the video that Eric shared with you earlier. So you can see the red dashed line is about where the coir log was originally installed. So you can see the green belt has really taken off. It's really doing its part to become established. The rocks are really helping dissipate a lot of that energy in the as the wave breaks. And along here, same coir log on the red dashed line. A lot of sand has accumulated in here, basically rebuilding their beach that they had lost over the years. And in this picture, this again, another great example of shoreline bioengineering. This project is on Pickerel Lake in Emmett County. It was about 80 feet. We actually used this as a demonstration project for contractor, the Certified Natural Shoreline Partnership Training Program. This is a county park, Camp Petasiga. They'd been mowing to the water's edge and realized they were losing a lot of shoreline in a short amount of time. So what we did here, we had a crew and we installed it all in one day. We had about 20, 25 probably folks that were going through the training. Here are the materials stockpiled in the upper left. Here's a crew getting the coir logs ready to drop along the shoreline. This project, because the bank height was variable, we used 3 different diameters of coir logs, so 16, 20, and 12-inch diameters, just because, again, that elevation needs to be pretty consistent. And so, again, given the bank height, that was kind of what we determined was best. Average stone about 6.5 inches, smallest about 3, and the largest about 12. Some of these rocks that were delivered exceeded that 12 inches. So you can specify what size diameter rock you want, but it's, again, that's a goal or aim. What you sometimes get delivered can be a little different from what you hope, but we made it work. And it was about a total of 20 to 25 cubic yards of fieldstone, and the fetch at this location was about 3 miles as well. We did install a 10 to 15 foot green belt. So we used native plants from Wild Type Nursery in Mason, Michigan. as well as an erosion control fabric. After the plants were installed, we did include a deer exclusion fence to make sure that the deer didn't come and browse everything. This picture here, even though it looks a little dry, I do want to point out, so that coir log, you can see there, and the waterheads, one was lower in this picture than when we installed the project. But you can see the organic material building up in between the voids or the gaps between the rock. And that was a really, really critical point, because then a year or two later, difficult to see, but the red arrow is basically where the toe stones would have been originally placed. And the blue arrow is where the coir log was. So all of that area between the coir log and the toe stones has accumulated organic material, and plants have become established in that area. Again, here, red dashed line shows about where that toe stone was, and the red dashed on the right-hand side is where the coir was. So it looks very different from what when it was originally installed, but this is really what we're hoping for. They've gained 4 to 5 feet easily of shoreline as a result of this project. And again, red dashed line shows about where that coir log was and the land that has built lakeward of the coir log. So with that, my last information I want to share with you is that we have a grant through the Michigan Department of Natural Resources to install, very much like Camp Petasiga in Emmett County, a natural shoreline project and is part of a contractor training workshop this August. It'll be located at Tourist Park in East Jordan. So we're working with city manager and their Parks and Rec department to get that in place, and also partnering with Lake Charlevoix Association. It will be basically specifically for contractors to really try to help them expand their understanding and knowledge of how to design and install high energy bioengineering projects. So save the date. You'll see more information regarding that opportunity soon, and we really hope to get some contractors from our region to attend. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Our next presenter we have is Julia Kirkwood, who is going to present on the Shoreline Stewards Program. Well, it looks like Julia is sharing her screen. You there, Julia?
Yep, sorry, I was having issues unmuting.
Oh, no problem.
Now
We can
I'm
hear you.
having issues like with my video, so.
Okay. Well, we have your audio and we have your
Okay.
presentation, so I think we're good.
There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, there it is.
Okay. All right. So I'm Julia Kirkwood, and I'm also with Eagle's Water Resources Division, and I work in what's called our non-point source pollution program, and it's been also known as our watershed management unit. I've been working in this program for about 20 years now. And since 2008, I started working with our Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. I'll talk about that in just a second. There we go. So the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership began in 2008 with a goal of trying to create healthier shorelines and options for healthier shorelines. And we had partners between Eagle, Michigan State University Extension, contractors, native plant experts, and nonprofit organizations like Tip of the Mitt and Michigan Lakes and Streams Association. And we've we call contractors that are actually doing this work, came together and really focused around 4 different objectives. We wanted to inform contractors, and that is what has become one of our main training programs, is our Certified Natural Shoreline Professional Training Program. And we've been holding one almost every year. We missed last year, but we had another one this year, and we'll have another one in the fall. We also have been focusing on policy changes. We recognized that we needed to make some policy changes to incentivize more healthier solutions and de-incentivize the solutions such as the seawalls. We also wanted to look at what works out there. What are the types of techniques are going to be workable from a landowner standpoint across a wide spectrum of property types, also across a whole huge level of energy, from low all the way into the higher energy. Been doing really good at the low energy. Now we're starting to focus more on the higher energy. And the fourth one is more what I'm going to talk about today, is educating property owners, because we could have all the contractors out there and doing the work, but if we don't have landowners that want to do the work and educate people about it, then we're not going to have the contractors doing the work. And the same goes, we could have all the property owners out there understanding that they want something different, but we don't have anybody to do the work. So it's been a long road, and we've made a lot of progress. And I will say, it may not seem like we made a lot of progress, but in the past, it's been almost 15 years now. It's been, from my perspective, it's been a huge progress in that I get emails, and I know other people get emails and phone calls almost on a weekly basis now. And that never would have happened even 10 years ago. So I just wanted to touch base a little bit about what Eric was talking about too, is where we're at right now is the suburban landscaping meets the lakeshore. And so what happens is we then remove all of that native vegetation and create these large expansive lawns, which actually invites erosion and destabilizes shorelines. The other thing that it does is that it creates the amount of habitat loss is huge. It's our #1 threat to our inland lakes at 50% poor condition, only as compared to only about 8 to 10% due to nutrients and turbidity. And that tells us a large thing, is that we are missing something. We've got a lot of work to do in closing that gap. And so as part of the Michigan Natural Shorelines Partnership's goal is we wanted a statewide recognition program that has consistent criteria, because we also knew that, even from my experience working with a lot of different lake groups, is they wanted their own program. But one is, if you look at each of different lakes trying to do the different programs, all the criteria are different and they weren't consistent. Plus, once you have volunteers starting the program and that volunteer leaves, well, the program goes away. So we wanted something that has consistent criteria, that is available long-term and doesn't change for the most part over time, and is available to any lake owner. We also needed it to have meaningful standards for lakeshore health. So we looked at a lot of the research. Eric in his slides talked about, had a huge list of all of the research that we looked at. And some of the other easy ones that's available is the DNR's conservation guidelines for Michigan lakes. There's a lot of different recommendations in there. And then this little handout here is state of Vermont put this together. And it really supports what Eric mentioned, that one of that quote is, there's a lot of depends. It's a not one size fits all. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish about what does that shoreline look like. So again, we took all of this into consideration to create our program. This was developed, we launched it in 2016. We spent a few years trying to pull this together. And we worked with one of our partners with a tip of the mitt was the main lead in terms of we had some grant money available. And we also pulled in some focus group of lake associations to help us with a design, help us with how the questions from, we could come up with certain questions. Those focus groups helped us define and tailor those questions as well. And Lake Charlevoix was one of those groups. Available online, it's free. You can register for an account or you can take it anonymously. We do recommend taking, actually registering because you get more information as a landowner. There are 3 recognition levels. It's gold, silver, or bronze, and not every property is going to qualify. And people say, well, why not? And we said, because that's just the way it is. There are some properties out there that are just way overdeveloped and will just not ever be to the point where it's saying that's healthy for the lake, because our goal is to share the shore. So unfortunately, there are some properties that won't qualify, and that's part of the goal. Is we want to push that envelope, push it to where, how do we share that shore, meet homeowners' needs and desires for access and recreational usage, as well as make sure that we maintain these healthy shorelines, as well as the rest of the property. Because we want to look at what's going on the land as well, because that affects the lake and it affects the shoreline. There are some properties that maybe they have a huge, vast lawn and no other major issues going on. They might score a starter level and you can come back and redo things. If you register, you can get and qualify, you can get a free certificate, and you can download that and print it. And there is an option to purchase a sign. People also ask, why do we have 3 different recognition levels? Because a bronze level property looks way different than a gold level. And not everybody is going to ever be able to get to the gold level either. And that's okay. We just recognize that the different levels are still, provide a good balance overall. We broke the property down into 4 different zones, because one of the challenges is, look, we have an online questionnaire. Without it being too exhaustive and too complicated, we wanted to ask questions that are impactful questions on each of these different areas of the lake. So we have the lake zone and the shoreline zone, and then the buffer, and your upland zone, which is the rest of your property. The questions are weighted by which questions are going to be most impactful on the overall health of the lake. So for example, like pet waste and not using phosphorus-based fertilizer, or only doing spot treatment for herbicide, and how you store your boats. Those are all important pieces. However, they are not as important as whether or not you have serious amounts of impervious surfaces, like your whole lot is filled with a patio, a concrete patio, or your whole lot is filled with an entire house, or the amount of vegetation. So if you have a really good buffer in the first 35 feet of your property, you're not going to be using fertilizer, and the pet waste is going to be dealt with for the most part. You're not going to have much erosion going on. So these questions in the dark green area are the ones that are going to be most impactful. And there are other questions as well. This is just a sample. So once you start getting into the survey, each question has its own page. So it asks this questions, and there's a variety of answers. And then these little kind of drop down boxes area provide more information. So if you have a question about, well, what do you mean by that? You can get more information, and it'll provide you links to find more information as well if you want to delve into that more. We provide graphics like this one to help you visually think about your property and how it is, and based on, like, for in this example, I'm looking at percentages of vegetation overall, both in the buffer and the upland zones. It's an example and every property is different. So we also had to factor that into how we ask the questions. It's a huge variety of lakes, a huge variety of how each of the properties are laid out. So the questions and answers take all of this into account. Properties with seawalls. We did not exclude every property with a seawall. And the reason why is because there are a lot of properties out there that have a seawall, and that there are large properties and maybe the house sits back from the edge of the lake, and there's just a big, huge lawn in, between the house and the lake. There's a lot of opportunities to restore some of that habitat loss. However, in these two examples, neither of these properties would ever qualify. There's just way too much impervious surfaces, the seawalls are too much. And both of the houses and other structures are way too close to the lake. Also, for the Shoreline Stewards program, we made the decision that any new seawalls after December 31st, 2018, those properties cannot qualify. However, this is all based on the honorary system. We're not going in and checking to say it's like, oh, we gotta, bump you out. We just don't have the capacity to do that. So we're basing this on everybody's, being truthful as much as possible. The other reason why we didn't want to exclude all the seawalls is, once you start saying, oh, you have a seawall and you can't be part of this program, it shuts down the conversation about all these other things that you can do on your property to improve the overall health of your property. So this is another example of the types of graphics and pictures that we provide to help you visualize and imagine what your property is, to help you better answer the questions for your property. So this is an example of a plan view and a side view of a small little property that has very little bank. There are other graphics that provide visually for like a Lake Charlevoix type shoreline as well. So this isn't the only one. There are other graphics that help support that. And again, I want to mention that the buffer zone is the first 35 feet from the top of your lake bank. So wherever that top of that lake bank is, that's where you start your buffer zone. So sometimes that shoreline zone is going to be pretty wide. Sometimes it's going to be very narrow. So that's an example of maybe what we're trying to push for. In this example, maybe a question is going to be answered. What percentage of your buffer zone has trees, shrubs, grasses, and flowers? In this example, it's going to be 75% or greater. And this is an example, say, as you further go down those percentages, once you get to the less than 10%, that's that's what we consider the big red zone. It's providing no habitat value whatsoever, and it makes your property more vulnerable to erosion. And I'll point out here in the left-hand side of this picture, there's a different property, and they've been mowing up to the edge. And what we refer to that as, human-caused accelerated erosion. In the property that the picture focuses on, there is absolutely no erosion going on, but the property next to them has removed all that native vegetation and has made their property vulnerable to erosion. And this example, this is, I don't even remember what lake this is, but every single one of these properties has less than 10% of vegetation in their buffer zone and their upland zone as well. The couple of good things I see is there's actually a lot of good aquatic vegetation in the lake. and I don't see any seawalls going on. So though, what tells me is all of these properties, for the most part, would have the potential to be able to qualify if they increased their on the land vegetation. Might be a couple of properties where their impervious surfaces are too high to qualify, but this is a great example of just immense, vast sizes of lawn. So what can you do instead? Well, there's a lot of options, and there's a huge variety based on your property and how it lays out. And one thing we like to use as well, it depends. Depends on what your desires are, it depends on the property. The biggest thing is prevention first and foremost. Do not get rid of your native vegetation, especially those trees and shrubs. They are the biggest thing to keep your property from not eroding. Also, if you ever look at a lake in its natural state, you will never see lawn at the edge. So create pathways, create a small swimming access area. And if you really want that view of the lake, trim those low branches or create a small little view shed as well. So an example, we are going to ask about how much impervious surface are there. Both, you'll get one of those questions in the buffer zone, and you're going to get one of those questions in your upland zone as well. And that includes how big is your house, the size of your house, boat houses and patios and sheds, etc. You have to factor all of that in. These are a couple of great examples of keeping that impervious surface to a minimum in the buffer zone. It doesn't mean you can't have a little patio down by the lake. Just keep it set back and allow water to infiltrate as well. Beach sanding. We do ask a question about how much of your property is artificial beach. There are a lot of lakes out there that do have a lot of natural beach. That is not what we're asking. What we're asking is, are you out there intentionally creating a beach? Are you intentionally manicuring your property to maintain that beach, whereas if it was natural vegetation or not? Are you bringing in sand? Beach sanding does need a permit. And what we ask is, it doesn't mean that you can't have a beach. What we ask is to minimize it. I know, people want to say, well, my grandkids, or I like to have a little beach and etc. Minimize those options. It's all about sharing the shore. And we really ask to not go in and dump sand, because it just doesn't stay there. Stormwater is another question, and this will particularly affect more of the upland areas. They're going to ask you a question, where's your stormwater going? If you have a parking area or your driveway or road, how's this water getting to the lake? Is it directly piped to the lake? And if so, we're going to ask you to think about making changes. Couple of options to do is utilizing a rain garden. The picture on the left is a rain garden designed to capture road runoff. This was on a lake down in Southwest Michigan. It was originally a sand and gravel road, and it was a pretty good slope, maybe about a 35-degree slope on this property, and all that water would run down into the lake. And then it was actually paved, so there was more water that was coming in there. So where it was running, all that rain garden captures that water. Other options too, sometimes there's road ends that are where you might have some road runoff going directly into the lake. There's options to redirect that water into stormwater infiltration to capture that water and filter it before it gets into the lake. So a lot of different kinds of options, and those are all kind of depends questions too. It depends on how much space you have and what's available, and funding too. The picture on the right, this property had this kind of interesting patio sitting way back from the lake. And there was this kind of defined waterway that was going into the lake. And previously they had completely mowed the whole thing and it was really wet. So they just ended up doing planting with native plants, which is probably what it would have been in naturally anyways. So they're restoring that function of that waterway a little bit more. From a Lake Charlevoix standpoint, so Chad talked about doing a GIS analysis. Well, Tip of the Mint has done since 2007 different shoreline inventories that looks at hardening of the shoreline, also green belts, looks at erosion, looks at a few other things as well. From a Lake Charlevoix standpoint, the results and the full report is available on the Tip of the Mint's water website under Lake Charlevoix Shoreline Survey. You cannot zoom in to find out every individual result, but if you are that landowner, you should have a unique ID number, and if you don't, you can contact the Watershed Council to be able to get that unique ID number to find out what your overall results are. And why I bring this up is from a Lake Charlevoix standpoint, looking at the overall shoreline survey results. And 2018 was the last full shoreline survey, and the greenbelt results is that 34% of the properties still had good to excellent on the parcels based, still good to excellent rating, with a 66% from a moderate to very poor rating. And I looked at recently at the overall level of respondents to the Shoreline Stewards survey has been 81 respondents. Now it doesn't sound like a lot, and maybe it isn't a lot for Lake Charlevoix, but Lake Charlevoix does have one of the highest numbers collectively around the lake. But that means it's only about 4.7% of properties that have responded to the Shoreline Stewards survey. But 72% of those qualify based on the owner response. Now, sometimes you might ask, it's like, well, how do you know if they're really doing what they do? And I said, well, again, it's on the honor system, and this isn't a perfect system. Sometimes I'll go in and I will look at some of these aspects and like, well, yeah, I probably wouldn't have answered it exactly like that. So it's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job of helping to push the envelope of what's healthy for the lake. So if you register, and you'll see this if you don't too, but if you are just doing it anonymously, you are allowed the opportunity anytime to save your answers and create an account. But if you are only doing it anonymously, once you close out your answers, you can't get back in and your answers are saved. So if you register, this is kind of what the end of the survey looks like. You have the opportunity to go in and go back and review your answers. You can't change your answers. Individually, you cannot change your answers. Then you are also provided these kinds of general areas for improvement. It'll give you some suggestions and provide some general resource information about where you could maybe go get some more information. You can also print your certificate, and you can print the entire report. So it'll give you all of your answers, and it'll give you all of the kinds of areas for improvement as well. So you can use that information if you want to make improvements, to have conversations with your spouse or with a contractor to help make those improvements. Then if you do make improvements, you can come back and you can take the survey again. It's set up right now that you can, you don't clear your answers. It just kind of it archives your answers. You're from the first survey, and you can take the survey again. And what that does is it kind of gives us maybe a general indicator of kind of measures of success of a before and after. Are we making any kind of change over time? It's not a lot of people that have done that. Still, it's still fairly new process. And you also have an opportunity to upload photos at this location. We don't require you to update or upload photos, and we also don't require you to make them publicly available. We do ask that question if you can let us use your pictures, because that's one question that we all get is like, well, do you have any pictures? And that's one thing that we struggle with, is just having good pictures out there to share. But what are some good examples? So we do ask that you upload pictures and allow us to use them as well. So for the Stewards program, we have a lot of resources available, and we created all of these so that people can use them and share them. We have the Shoreline Stewards program guide. You can download that, you can download it, and you can send it via email to anybody and everybody if you want. There are some hard copies available, not that many, but Tip of the Mitt might still have some, and I'm pretty sure Lake Charlevoix has some still. And we also have a promotional card that we have PDFs available for those. We created a mailer. I know in the Northwest area, one county mailed them out to every lake property owner. There's sample articles that you can use for newsletters. And we also have a video series. There's an introduction and then one video for each of the different zones. So it can help you understand what we're asking in terms of like where your zone is and how to make some changes, etc. So all of this is available. You can find it on the shore, some of the resources you can find on the Shoreline Stewards website. The videos are linked on the Natural Shoreline Partnerships website, but hosted on Eagle's website. Then we also have the Shoreline Stewards Ambassadors Toolkit. So this is for lake volunteers who want to educate and talk to people and spread the word about the program around their lake. All of this training is on the Shoreline Partnerships website. There's a bunch of different kinds, PowerPoint presentations for kind of each different topics. There's the whole toolkit, and it's basically kind of a step-by-step process to get you started. Oops. Okay, and then let's see, learn about some more upcoming events. The Michigan Lakes and Streams Association annual conference is in person this year. It's May 6th and 7th, so it's an opportunity to learn more about lakes and a lot of different topics there. We also have the Michigan Inland Lakes Convention coming up in September, and it is virtual again this year. It's 3 days, and there will be a lot of different topics centered around lakes. So the lake convention is only about $60, $65 for like 3 days of learning. Let's see. So one of the things that I like to say is not everyone can do everything, but everyone can do something. I think I saw a question about, well, you know, if you already have a seawall, what are your options? Well, it isn't always practical or feasible to remove a seawall to a natural shoreline. Those are kind of, well, it depends. There are a lot of sites that it would be practical and feasible, but it comes down to cost, it comes down to space, and etc. But these are a couple of different examples here in these pictures. We ask that one good best management practice is putting riprap in front of a seawall and planting it. Or on the picture on the right, it was a 45-degree slope down to the lake that was mowed. And it was a pretty steep slope to try to mow. And then it's really hard to not fall into the lake. So this landowner planted that slope into native vegetation. Another question was about, well, what about plants? A native plants is critical to the success of a bioengineering project or any kind of restoring any kind of habitat resiliency. And that's what we're looking for, is how do we recreate resilient shorelines? On the Natural Shoreline Partnerships website, there is a lot of information out there in terms of more resources, types of books. You can download a lot of them. We also have a plant list, and the plant lists are organized by the plants where they will be most successful at the shoreline. In general, sedges, grasses, and rushes are the best for right at the lake edge. They have the root structure to be able to hold it, and they're designed to be at the lake edge. Shrubs are incredible as well to help break up that ice. And then add in some of the color into the flowers. Sometimes I'll see some designs that it's just all flowers, and like, it's not going to hold the shoreline. And particularly the flowers that they were choosing, the root structure was really weak. So making sure there's some sedges and some grasses, and based on where you are in the state as well. I might not, there are certain species that you might choose, like if you're up in the western UP, it might be different than what might be down in the southeast part of Michigan. So you just get a general idea. And there may be some species that are not on that list that would also be good species. I also have on the partnerships website where you can find native plants as well. There's a link to different native plant suppliers in Michigan, and they're organized by where they're located throughout the state. Let's see, one other thing. I think that's it. If there was any questions on that. So I do recommend checking out the Shoreline Partnerships website. There is an enormous amount of website. And if you wanted to check, Eric mentioned checking out some different fact sheets that are available that the, Eagle just did. I have those linked as well. I have sometimes you might not be able to find how do you navigate Eagle's website. Sometimes it's a little challenging. There is information even on the Shoreline Partnerships website to get you to the permit information as well. All right. I think that's it. I think I will unshare.
Many thanks, Julia. A great presentation, and Jennifer as well. And I think right now we're getting to the point in the webinar where we're going to have some a little more Q&A. So if you have questions for Jennifer or Julia, enter those now, and then we have some closing comments. So I'm not sure, Anne or Eric, I don't know if somebody wanted to take a look at the Q&A, if there's any that you wanted to ask.
I see one question about, does the contractor explain how to install coarse woody debris? At this time, no. We typically are training contractors that have never done anything like this. So it's really about kind of creating the foundation. However, if you're taking the training, that's definitely a question that can be asked. One of the contractor trainings we actually did, if you go on the Shoreline Partnerships website, it's one of the demonstration sites. It was on Crockery Lake in Kent County or Ottawa County. And there was part of the training was utilizing dead ash trees that were at the site. So they dropped them in as part of a coarse wooded debris event, but that's not the case in every situation.
Okay, thanks, Julia. And then I see one on here. And this is more for, this is more for Eagle. Is the Lake Charlevoix shoreline consistent with Great Lakes shoreline when Eagle approves a permit for rock sizes. And so I don't know if anybody can answer that, or if Ann or Eric, if there were any in there that you wanted to answer. I know you've been kind of taking a look at the chat or wanted to address of the questions. We haven't gotten a lot of new ones in since the first couple of presentations, but there are a few.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say that, so Lake Charlevoix is considered an inland lake, not a Great Lake. So the category, the GPNMP category information, where it specifies Great Lakes versus inland lakes, it follows the inland lake category. However, you know, Eagle does have the ability to approve things outside of that category if there is a demonstrated need for that. So there are times when different rock sizing may be approved on a permit.
And I'll add too, I mean, if you're asking if the rock sizes will be the same on the Great Lakes, that's going to be a depends. Every site it's not a one size fit all. And if you look at the energy on Lake Michigan, it's going to be different. So those rock sizes, if you think back on Jen's presentation, is going to be based on that the fetch is going to be enormous, and the largest wave that you're liable to you see, and what's going on at the slope out there as well. So that it's all huge amounts of depends. So it just depends on your site conditions. Oh, and I will say too, if you want to know more about a couple things, on the Shoreline Partnerships website is the Shoreline and Shallows Conference. In our 2021 conference, we were able to record our conference, and there are two presentations. One is another one of Jen's. It was a little bit more in depth on the designing for high energy and different options. And also one by Brian Micah from GEI Consultants, who's a founding member of the Shoreline Partnership. And he discusses how waves work. And both of those I would highly recommend checking out.
All right. Ann, Eric, or anybody, any other questions in there that you see in the chat, I guess, that you want to address before we move on with the closing comments?
I think we hit all of them.
Yeah, I don't really think there's anything, I mean, I think most of it was covered, so we should probably just get the last couple people.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, there were, and I know there were quite a few duplicates, so it's kind of difficult to sort through. But I believe, Eric, did you want to, I think you had some slides, or we also had Jennifer McKay with Tip of the Mitt, and Tom Darton had some comments too that they wanted to make.
Sure, I just have a couple slides that I wanted to highlight some of our newer resources here really quick. So on our shoreline protection website, which is linked here, we have 5 new fact sheets on some shoreline best management practices. These kind of go over the basics of each one of these practices and kind of points the reader in the direction of additional information. So these are kind of just a gateway, you know, to get people interested, or, you know, to get a little bit of introductory information on each one of these best management practices. So I wanted to point those out. And also we have on our shoreline protection website these illustration and plan fact sheets. So it's like a little 3-pager, and the front page is this nice illustration of the practice, and then the plan view and cross section correspond to what this drawing looks like. So we have these for seawall replacements with best management practices, low and high energy bioengineering designs, riprap, docks and boardwalks through wetland, and shoreline woody structure. So check those out. I think this will be coming out probably next week, potentially another couple of weeks. But this is completed. We're just kind of putting together the outreach package for it. This is our example of the story map that we've been putting together. So the story map provides some information on a bunch of different bioengineering projects around the state. So you can, for example, around Lake Charlevoix, you can click on, one of these projects and it opens up a window with both before, after pictures of what this shoreline looked like, before bioengineering was installed and after. And then it can be kind of handy too, because there's a bunch of information, and there's more information than what's listed here. You gotta kind of scroll down, and I wasn't able to screenshot all of it, but you can compare your property to, in terms of energy level, for example, to the energy level of the bioengineering projects to really get a handle and, to kind of see what potentially might be available at your site. It also gives costs, maintenance, and a variety of other information, kind of a lot of common questions we get about bioengineering for each one of these projects. So, and this is going to be kind of a living website where we're going to be continually adding additional sites and some additional information on all of these. So outreach for that is going to, like I said, start here really soon. So keep an eye out through the same channels that you learned about this webinar, and the link to this will be released. We also did another larger webinar over the winter time with some additional information and details. It's really similar to the information that was covered here today, but I wanted to throw that link up if you're interested in viewing that as well. And Julia and Janet already discussed the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, but there's a link to that here as well. So I also wanted to highlight, this is our kind of splash page for My Waters, which is our permitting and compliance database. So this, you can, you don't need an account to kind of use the Sitemap Explorer. So the Sitemap Explorer is kind of laid out like a Google map where it has little points wherever any type of permitting or compliance activity has been occurring. So you can zoom in on an area of interest and see what permits have been issued there, or what documents are available in My Waters. But in order to apply for a permit, you do need to create an account in order to do that. So this is our joint permit application website. It's just a wall of links, but there's a lot of useful information in here if you can take the time to sift through it a little bit. I'd like to point out the pre-application meeting link down here that allows you the opportunity to meet with district staff, talk through potential project, kind of key out any concerns or potential roadblocks along the way, and they'll kind of point you in the right direction in terms of potential things to consider for your project. And I also included, when this presentation is shared, so you guys have all of the links in one spot. This is our land water interface permitting staff map with contact information there, as well as links to some of our pages. So yeah, that's all that I'll share, and I can turn it over to Jen McKay and Tom for some closing remarks.
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, all right. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Tom Darnton. I serve as president of the Lake Charlevoix Association. My purpose to be here today is to announce a newly funded project to bring together what we've learned about shoreline protection from the dual challenges of the record-breaking high water and the pandemic's impact on our government's ability to respond. The project is funded in part by Lake Charlevoix Association and in part by generous grant from the Charlevoix County Community Foundation. We're partnering with Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council and LIAA, a Traverse City-based nonprofit with the capacity to design and manage an effective community-based process for regional planning. We'll be working with the existing organizational structure that's provided by the Lake Charlevoix Watershed Management Plan. Our objective is to bring together representatives of the 10 units of local government and the numerous private sector stakeholders within our watershed to take a fresh look at shoreline protection on Lake Charlevoix. We have a very unique lake from which it follows that we need solutions that are designed with our particular conditions in mind. This grant will help us further refine what we know about those solutions. We will identify improved designs tailored to our lake, improved methods of communicating with the people making decisions about shorelines, and improved methods of regulating shoreline development. With the water level dropping again this year, we've been granted some breathing space. At LCA, we see this as an opportunity to learn from our collective experience. We believe that it is possible to have a lake where people, birds, fish, mammals, and amphibians all have their place. We will be reaching out to people and organizations who have been active in the Watershed Advisory Committee in the past. Please watch your email for further information. The advisory committee work is open to anyone who would like to be involved, and we'll put contact information in the chat function about how you do that. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you to Eagle and all of the presenters today, including Jennifer Buchanan from the Watershed Council. It was great information, providing a lot of good quality detail on shoreline protection for Lake Charlevoix that can be applicable throughout the state of Michigan. This is also just the beginning of the efforts. As Tom mentioned, we'll be continuing our efforts throughout the Lake Charlevoix watershed, working with local governments. But I also wanted to announce that the Watershed Council, in concert with the Lake Charlevoix Association, LEA, and Eagle, will also be hosting a Lake Charlevoix Day in person on June 13th. That's a Monday. It'll be at the Lake Charlevoix or the Charlevoix Public Library. It'll be a full day event where we have the opportunity to dive into these topics a bit more. So we'll offer presentations on water levels and climate change and how that impacts the shoreline area. We'll have topics discussing tools for local governments and how citizens can get involved in those public processes. We'll also have more in-depth discussions about bioengineering and natural shorelines, as well as have the opportunity for discussions to hear from the public, riparians, as well as local government and contractors on challenges and hindrances to shoreline management. So stay tuned, look for information on the Watershed Council website, as well as your inbox and social media for more information on that upcoming event. And once again, I'd like to thank all the participants who attended today, as well as everyone who presented, and Eagle for helping raise this issue in the Lake Charlevoix watershed.
Yeah, many thanks, Jennifer and Tom. Like Jennifer said, thanks to our presenters, everyone that attended, and tip of the mitt. I just have just a couple last things to share, kind of logistical things before we wrap up here. Let's see here. I want to share just some information on another webinar we have coming up. So tomorrow, oops. There it is. Tomorrow from 2 to 3, we have another Shoreline Stewards Program webinar, very similar to the one information that you saw today that Julia shared. But you can pass that on to anyone that might be interested, or watch it again if you'd like. www.michigan.gov/Eagle events is where you can find that, and you can register for that webinar tomorrow. Also, we'll be following up with a couple emails, so keep an eye on your inbox. And we'll provide some information as far as contacts. We'll provide copies of the slides that were presented today, a link to the recording, and a survey. And we appreciate your feedback. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap this webinar up. Thanks for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.